A new report by the UN Weather Agency estimates that the number of people with inadequate access to water will top 5 billion by 2050, and that's up from 3.6 billion in 2018. The agency calls for more financing and urgent action to improve cooperative water management. The report warned that climate change is expected to increase water-related hazards such as droughts and floods.
The State of Climate Services 2021 Water Report is a collaboration between the world's Meteorological Organization, international organizations, development agencies, and scientific institutions. The Secretary General of the UN WMO, Petteri Tallis, says global water resources management is fragmented and inadequate, and countries should urgently adopt reforms to ramp up financing and boost cooperation on emergency warning systems ahead of a looming crisis.
Most of the impacts of climate change, they are felt through water, which I will soon demonstrate to you, and also that's one of the key components of disasters. Actually, those are the most frequent disasters, and they are the ones which are having also biggest impact on human life and also on economy. So we should enhance the water resource management, especially in SIDS countries and LDC countries. And we should invest in drought and flooding services, both especially in African countries and Asian countries, and we have also major gaps in observation systems and also in availability of data, and that should be enhanced.
Despite some recent advances, it found that 107 countries remain off track for a target to sustainably manage their water resources by 2030.
And we have already seen a change in the amount of water. There's been a drop of 1 centimeter per year during the past 20 years, and the biggest losses have been taking place in glaciers at Antarctica and Greenland, and also at the mountain glaciers. And the bad news from most recent IPCC report is that this melting is supposed to continue for the coming centuries, not only for the coming years or coming decades, but the coming centuries, because we have already been reaching high level of carbon dioxide. So it means that this problem doesn't go away.
The report calls for more financing and urgent action to improve cooperative water management, naming the need for better flood warning systems in Asia and drought warning systems in Africa.
And according to our sister organization FAO, there has been already 2 billion inhabitants of our planet, 1/4 of our planet, where people have been exposed to major water stress, and there's a lack of drinking water and also lack of water for agriculture. And also the water resource management is limited. According to our sister organization UNEP, we have 107 countries which are not managing their water resources in a sustainable way.
Tallis also said the major gaps in data were worst in Central Asia, Africa, and among island states. In some cases, he said information gaps can prove deadly, such as when Zimbabwe opened its dams during Cyclone Ida in 2019, which exacerbated flooding in downstream Mozambique. The WMO said more than 300,000 people have been killed by floods and more than 700,000 by droughts and their impact on food production.
For more on this, we're now joined by Dr. Maxx Dilley, who's the Deputy Director for Climate Services at the World Meteorological Organization. Dr. Dilley, a very good evening to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
All right, I'm intrigued by some of the language in this report, and so I'm going to use some of the words, and then you can help us unpack what it means. So the first one is water resource management being fragmented and inadequate. translate that into language that we understand. What does it mean?
Well, I think many of your viewers may recall from about 2015 to 2018 in Cape Town, there was a 3-year drought that got to be so severe that there was even in the first quarter of 2018 a day zero that was identified, after which further withdrawals of water wouldn't even be possible. And it took a lot of different measures to deal with that situation. There were water restrictions. Farmers had to abandon crops, but little by little, new irrigation methods were adopted to save water, and there was some leaky infrastructure that was fixed, and eventually those measures to save water and manage the water resource better, along with some improvements in the rainfall later in 2018, started to lead to a recovery of the water resources that the Cape Town needed. So, you know, I think that case demonstrates the need to anticipate these kinds of fluctuations in water supply, and to have plans in place really to manage those situations when they arrive. And I think people would know that in 2019, Cape Town adopted a new water strategy, and that puts the city on a path to have a better and more coherent response, I believe, in the future.
All right, so I guess what we're talking about here is anticipating, managing risk, and managing these leakages that can happen through inadequate planning and management. But that's only part of the story, isn't it? Because the other part of the story is the drought arrived.
Well, that's right. And so the kinds of questions that an event like that raises are, what are the likelihood that such conditions will return? I remember back in the early 1990s, there was a very severe drought in Southern Africa. And as was mentioned in the reporting, you also have these cyclones coming in off the Indian Ocean, bringing heavy rainfall. So how much early warning measures can be implemented so that these conditions can be anticipated? And what are the implications of the cyclical nature, the return of these extremes for water use management over the long term? So it's not something that comes once and then never comes again. It's a recurrent phenomenon, and the systems and services that it takes to anticipate those conditions and to be able to manage them appropriately do need strengthening. The hydrological observing systems are not what they need to be, and there are also needs to improve data management and forecasting. And then, of course, the provision of the information to water managers and the public so that the appropriate actions can be taken in advance and during such events.
More and more, you hear people say that future wars are going to be fought over water. That's how much value is going to be attributed to this, and that there's been a commoditization of water over time. And I just wonder if, you know, we talk about equity in so many arenas. Could we be talking about it in water supply?
Well, water is already a very sensitive issue in some regions. And one of the most prevalent examples where we see this is in river basin management, because these river basins, while they can sometimes be contained within a single country, sometimes they're transboundary. And when that happens, the countries can get into a kind of a competitive relationship with each other over the use of the resource. So when these conditions arise, our organization, the World Meteorological Organization, promotes transparent sharing of the data about what the water supply conditions are like and what the conditions are for all the countries across the entire basin. as a basis for a transparent negotiation over an equitable allocation of water to all of the countries that share that water and need to use it. So our Congress, the governing body of the World Meteorological Organization, we are a member state organization. The World Meteorological Congress will meet later this month and consider a new data policy that calls for data to be shared on a free and unrestricted basis among countries. We have resolutions like that already in place, but this new policy, if it's adopted, will strengthen those existing policies and replace them with something that would really promote this kind of data access, which we believe to be a real important underpinning source of information for equitable use of water resources, especially when multiple countries are concerned.
Your report also talks about, it says 60% of national meteorological and hydrological services mandated to provide basic hydrological information, warning services to government, just don't have the capacity. If they don't have the capacity, the consequences are being felt, and we're seeing it, and it's part of that water resource management story you're talking about.
Right. When you have these water crises, often triggered by droughts and floods, as we were just discussing, it is a sign that water resources are not being managed optimally. And when we see the kinds of impacts that occur during these events, water is such an important resource, not just as a sector in its own right, but also for drinking water supply, for human health, for agriculture and food security, for energy, for hydropower, and so on. So when these events occur and we have damages and losses and disruption, it shows that society is not ready. And being ready means having data that shows you what the likelihood of these events occurring is, how severe they can be, where they're likely to occur, and then having plans in place and strategies, management measures for dealing with them in the best possible way. And the systems that are needed to support that kind of planning and coherent action are, as you mentioned, and as the report documents, are not fully adequately in place in many countries around the world. And it starts with observations, but it goes right on through the data management systems and the forecasting systems, right up to the provision of early warnings and information for decision makers. And there are problems across that whole value chain in many cases, but one of the most sort of weakest links in the chain, if you will, is the interaction between the hydrometeorological services that every country has and the water management decision-making community. And there needs to be a stronger engagement between those two communities to really understand what the needs are for information on the one hand, and the supply of that information coming from the hydrometeorological community on the other. And this is one of the things that we tried to highlight in the report as an area that really needs to be strengthened.
All right, yeah, collaboration, and it's not just between agencies, but also between countries. An example you cite is when Zimbabwe opened up its dams during Cyclone Idai in 2019, exacerbating the flooding downstream in Mozambique. And had they had that conversation with Mozambique, perhaps different decisions might have been made.
Yes, it's a classic example, and it's not just the case that you mentioned where we've seen this. These big reservoir installations are very, very powerful management tools because, I mean, that's what they're designed for after all, is to store water and then to release it for not just hydropower generation, but for agricultural purposes and drinking water and so on. And in Southern Africa, there is actually a high degree of predictability of seasonal rainfall thanks to the influences of some of the big ocean circulation patterns that either promote or inhibit rainfall in the subcontinent. And so that predictability can be used to actually modify the reservoir operating rules so that in seasons where above normal rainfall is anticipated, the operators can leave some headroom in the dam so that the reservoir doesn't fill up to the point where lots of water has to be spilled out of it suddenly. And at the same time, when the forecast or the prediction is for below normal rainfall, the reservoir operators can retain more water in anticipation that more water will be needed in the later part of the season. So this is an example of the information product that can be provided that allows a reservoir, in this case, to be managed more optimally to reduce the risks of this kind of release and flooding in one scenario, and then the next time when it's dry, you've released too much and then you run out of water for generating power and the other uses. So it's a very good case of where the kind of information that's it's possible to provide could make a very significant difference in the outcomes.
All right, we've run out of time, but perhaps finally, what are your recommendations? I mean, what do we need to do and do well urgently?
Well, this is the big picture question that you're asking is, we have climate change showing itself more and more strongly in more and more parts of the world. And we know and have read in the recent IPCC reports what some of those manifestations are now, and as well as what they're likely to be in the future. So there really does need to be a major increase in investments in hydrometeorological systems and services, and in the planning processes and the management measures to deal with these extreme climate conditions that are already starting to materialize and that we may see more of going forward.
Dr. Maxx Dilley, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us and sharing this very important information with us today. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.